Money, or the lack of it, was a constant problem for Chapman. Ferrari and later Renault virtually had the backing of their respective governments. Chapman always had to fight for private finance and resented having it taken off him for the public purse.
Chapman had a deep dislike of paying income tax if he could possibly avoid it, and this was extended to all aspects of Team Lotus. So fairly early on in the 1960s, when he was running some very expensive professional drivers, Jimmy Clark and Graham Hill, he and Fred Bushell together established an operation called GPD, Grand Prix Drivers, which was an offshore company. I think it had roots in Panama and was operated out of Geneva. And the purpose of this was to avoid any funds being channeled back into the United Kingdom and becoming subject to British income tax.
And unfortunately, I had said, well, of course, this is a perfectly good example of tax evasion. And he nearly got up and hit me. And he gave me a great big lecture how about tax evasion is a crime, tax avoidance is a science, and that he was all involved with the science and didn't want to know about the crime.
Chapman now seemed to lose his passion for racing. It would be 4 years before Lotus won another race. With his sponsors threatening to quit, Lotus sales were crashing in the States due to new safety regulations. He desperately needed a new source of cash. One day in 1978, racing journalist Peter Windsor found himself alone in Chapman's office.
I sat down and there was a notepad in the middle of the desk, and I kid you not, in the middle of the notepad there was just one word, and it was DeLorean, with a line under it, and it was Chapman's handwriting.
The DeLorean sports car presents crisp aerodynamic Italian styling, featuring fully counterbalanced gull-wing doors, forward luggage compartment carpeted.
John DeLorean, previously number 2 at General Motors, was a marketing genius. With this slick video, he was able to sell a dream. No one would have known that the cars it featured were just 2 cobbled-together prototypes. Within 9 days, the British government gave him £35 million to build a factory in strife-torn Belfast. It opened in early 1981 with much fanfare and closed a year later amid controversy. Falling sales, bad reviews and accusations of DeLorean's extravagance encouraged the government to refuse more funds. Within the year, £80 million of public money had been lost. The scandal arose when the receiver went through the books and alleged that design work on the car, carried out by Lotus, had been paid for twice. The second payment, of over $17 million, went to a mysterious Swiss company, GPD, in a contract signed by John DeLorean, Lotus finance director Fred Bushell, and Colin Chapman. It had been 4 years earlier when Chapman first heard news of the DeLorean grant. He was furious.
Lotus applied to the government for a loan or a grant of about £400,000 to assist with further forward development, and the company received what you can only call the lame duck letter. Within days, Colin had read, and we'd all read, that John DeLorean was going to receive £35 million for what was a job-creating scheme in Northern Ireland to build sports cars on a greenfield site. Create jobs, one up to the government. Colin saw this as a personal snub. He saw this as a subsidised effort to destroy our market, because we were very strong in North America where the DeLorean was going to be sold, and the cars would meet head on. And he was naturally very, very angry. And he called a very short, sharp meeting, and he said, we're going to have some of that.
Chapman's chance came when DeLorean told the British government he could turn his early prototype into a production model in a quarter of the usual time.
DeLorean desperately needed somebody to actually make a car that would actually be roadworthy and pass the very stringent American tests. And he went to Porsche first of all, and they said, well, we'll do it, but it'll take us 7 years. We take 7 years to make a new car, and it'll cost you £40 million. And he had 18 months. He promised to do it in 18 months. And so he went to BMW, and they said, well, we'll do it in 4 years, but it'll cost you about £50 million. We don't really want to do it anyway. And he went around everywhere, and the one person he knew could do it for him and he had immense admiration for, was Colin Chapman.
DeLorean was desperate to sign Chapman. He first tried to buy Lotus when Chapman complained that the DeLorean would put Lotus out of business in North America. But the negotiations were hampered by Chapman's insistence on secrecy. They went on for 4 precious months of DeLorean's tight schedule, culminating in a marathon meeting in Geneva.
What we do know is that DeLorean went there almost alone. He didn't take any of his financial people from New York at all, who didn't know where he was, didn't know what he was doing, and he never briefed them on what had happened there. We do know that in his pocket he had a check for $12.5 million, burning a hole in his pocket all that time. We also do know that Chapman and Bushell went on their own. A solicitor did come over from Northern Ireland, but sat outside, did nothing, and wasn't party to any of those talks. So these two men, Chapman and DeLorean, both of them hyperactive people, both had an attention span of 5 seconds. Neither of them could sit still in a room at all, ever, in their whole lives, for 4 days, and they didn't even like each other. Sat in this hotel room, negotiating something.
At some point during those 4 days, Chapman finally refused to sell Lotus. But he agreed to redesign the DeLorean if the profits on the job were paid up front to a Swiss company, GPD. The check in DeLorean's pocket for $12.5 million was money from his American investors, but he raised the amount to $17.65 million to get Chapman. But even with this deal on the table, at the last minute, Chapman still wavered, openly contemptuous of DeLorean's prototype.
He couldn't see how this car could work, and he kept saying, nothing on your car works. You're trying to build this car with these gull-wing doors just because it's a gimmick. But you can't do that, because if you gull-wing doors, you have to hinge in the middle of the roof, and they have to come down an awful long way down to the bottom, and they won't fit. And what if the car rolls over, he said. If it rolls over and sits on its roof, how do you get out of this car? The American authority would just never pass it. They won't allow it. This car is a nonsense, and I don't want to build it. And DeLorean kept compromising and kept coming back and kept coming back. And Chapman was for walking out of the deal. He actually genuinely didn't want DeLorean's money at that point. It's a very interesting point. And it was Fred Bushell who kept pulling him back and saying, we need the money. We need this work. Please, come back in and talk to the guy. At least talk to the guy. Keep talking. And sometime during that period, and we can only speculate here, I don't think we'll ever fully know the answer, but sometime during that period, John DeLorean must have said, look, we will pay this money. I've raised now $17.65 million for research and development. Now, I'm going to give you, he must have said half, because we now know they've effectively split that money.
And Colin Chapman.
DeLorean claims that Chapman got all the money, then spent half of it on DeLorean shares.
Happened. Chapman was convinced that our company was going to put his out of business. So he refused to take the contract unless he had an opportunity to buy a substantial interest in DeLorean Motor Company.
That substantial interest was $60 million worth of DeLorean shares, which he says Chapman got for the bargain price of $8.5 million.
And DeLorean went back to America knowing that now he had the world's greatest car engineer who was going to build his car for him. But it wasn't anymore going to be a DeLorean car. It was now a Lotus car, because the only way Chapman can do it in those 18 months was basically to build the car that he was already building, the Turbo Esprit. It was going to be his new model. So basically this DeLorean car became a version, a slightly altered version, of the Turbo Esprit.
Well, there's no question you've got a beautiful car there. It reminds me a lot of a Lotus Esprit, and I guess that's not surprising since it was designed by...
No, I don't think it looks like a Lotus at all.
What does it remind you of?
It's unique. Doesn't remind me of anything that's ever been done before.
Corvette or Porsche?
No, doesn't look like any of those.
Not even a bit like a Lotus?
No, I don't see where the similarity is to Lotus. Lotus is a different automobile.
It's a chassis of my Lotus land.
Well, as you see, the chassis has a very Lotus-like design, but then this is what we understand and which we believe works well.
Yeah.
And it's very nice to see John DeLorean productionizing it and producing it in such large volumes.
Yeah.
But less than 9,000 DeLoreans were made before the factory closed. The missing millions would haunt Chapman for the rest of his life. About the upfront payment of $17 million to GPD was stalled by Chapman, who managed to put the meeting off for 6 months until October of that year.
Chapman's stance throughout the meeting was to deny any knowledge of the 17.65. He said it's a number he'd heard quoted. He denied that his company had received any of that particular money.
Chapman felt it was none of the receiver's business. He was notoriously cavalier about where money came from and went to. The millions from racing sponsors were rarely accountable. He felt what he did with the profits from the DeLorean job was his affair.
We made a contract with Colin Chapman and with GPD, which was a company he owned in Switzerland, to do the engineering work. The contract called for the upfront payment of the profits on the contract to go to GPD. We took that contract to the government, to the Secretary for Northern Ireland, to the NIDA, and to the Bank of England, and had it approved prior to entering into it. Once we did, before we could make the payments, we had to go to the Bank of England and again to the same people who issued the checks to make the payments. They agreed to it, and they knew exactly what was happening.
DeLorean and Chapman kept pointing out the GPD contract was legal. But Chapman claimed to the receiver that the $17 million payment to GPD was an introductory fee for bringing him and DeLorean together.
He came across relaxed, very confident, as I say, very healthy, with a very good suntan, and he seemed to be convinced of what he was telling us. He seemed to take the view that if he answered our questions and if we were sensible chaps, we would understand his explanation. He didn't seem to be anything other than perfectly normal to him that $17.5 million could be paid as an introductory fee.
But Chapman's story was contradicted by a letter adding a condition to the GPD contract, a copy of which journalists investigating the DeLorean affair had been handed anonymously. They eventually put it before Fred Bushell, Chapman's finance director.
And finally we produced a letter which had been signed by Colin Chapman and by Fred Bushell in that hotel in 1978 in Geneva, which actually committed the group Lotus, that's the public company, guaranteeing GPD's work. It actually specifically named GPD. The group Lotus was guaranteeing GPD. Now this letter was dynamite. And we put that letter on the table, and Fred Bushell said, "I've never seen that letter before." And I said, "Is that your signature?" And he said, "Well, it might be." I said, "Well, it's either your signature or the thing is a forgery. But if it's not a forgery, this letter actually does show that not only did you know about GPD, but you actually guaranteed GPD's work as a public company. And the shareholders never knew that. You were guaranteeing an enormous contract which would bust Group Lotus, and very nearly did." At that stage he asked for a pause. And I remember we went out and the tension in the room was crackling.
This letter proved that the shareholders of Lotus were being defrauded. Chapman and Bushell had failed to declare to the Lotus shareholders the upfront profit paid to GPD, which eventually showed up in Chapman and Bushell's Swiss accounts. Only 5 days after signing the DeLorean contract, knowing he had crossed the line between bending the rules and serious fraud. Behind his public confidence, life was getting complicated. Chapman had raised Britain to the top of Grand Prix racing. His energy, charisma and innovative genius affected all who came into contact with him. But the constant pressure of finding finance had driven him to the GPD contract, which now threatened everything he had built up over 30 years. By the end of 1982, imprisonment, ruin and disgrace threatened to overwhelm him. A week before Christmas, he flew back from Paris, landing in darkness. He would not see the dawn. At 4 a.m. he died of a massive heart attack in his wife's arms. It was December the 16th, 1982, and Chapman was 54. Ten years after Chapman's death, his loyal accountant Fred Bushell pleaded guilty to fraud in relation to the DeLorean affair and was sentenced to 3 years in jail. At his trial, the judge said on the evidence before him, if Chapman had been in the dock, he would have got 10 years.